Good afternoon. I'm Greg Henderson. I'm the editorial director of Drovers, and I want to welcome you to this webinar to discuss the impact of drought on the U.S. cattle industry. This afternoon, I'm joined by cattlemen from 3 different states. From Texas, we have Joe Leathers, manager of the 4 Sixes Ranch in Guthrie; Tony Toso, president of the California Cattlemen's Association from Mariposa County, California; and Steve Hansen, who is president-elect of the Nebraska Cattlemen from Elsie, Nebraska. Before we hear from these cattlemen, I want to ask Oklahoma State University agricultural economist Dr. Darrell Peel to provide some perspective on how this historic drought has already changed the course of cattle production and marketing for this year and even over the next few years. I must mention we will have time at the end for questions, and you may send those questions to us by typing them in the chat room or the Q&A. With that, we'll go right to Dr. Peel.
All righty. Well, thank you, Greg, and good afternoon, everyone. We'll take a quick look at kind of some of the perspective on what we're seeing so far and a little bit of what it already suggests about what's coming up next. Next slide, please. So if you look at the latest drought monitor map, we'll get another one tomorrow morning. But you know, the drought has been in place. In fact, we're going to talk about that. But it has expanded significantly in recent weeks in the southern plains, up into parts of the Midwest now, and in the central plains. And so, in fact, right now, almost 69% of the U.S. is in D0, which is abnormally dry, through D4, and of that, almost 52% of the country is in some stage of drought from D1 to D4. Next, please. This slide shows you the colors of the drought monitor map over the last 22 years. And, you know, as you look at this and look on the right-hand side, in the last year to 18, almost 24 months, we're in as severe a drought and prolonged a period of drought as we've been in for a long time. And that's important because some of the effects we're seeing now are really cumulative effects over the last couple of years. Next slide. So this was about 1 year ago. This is approximately what the picture looked like about a year ago. Obviously, the drought was extremely severe in the Southwest and all across the West, and particularly up in the northern plains, Montana, Wyoming, the Dakotas, more so than it was. If you remember the slide just a minute ago, those areas have actually, at least to some extent, have improved this year. Next slide. You can even go back 2 years ago when this really kind of started, and the drought was pretty severe in the southern Rocky Mountain region. We did have some cow culling regionally in 2020, not enough that we really noticed it in the data on a national perspective. Certainly, it was a very important issue in certain regions. But last year's drought did cause on an annual basis, a 9% increase in beef cow slaughter. And so far this year, we're running about 14% above year-ago levels through the first half of the year. Next slide. So here are the pasture and range conditions as reported by USDA. It really just mirrors and mimics what the drought monitor is telling us. This slide is based on the percent poor and very poor. So the higher up you are, the worse off you are. And the red line is the national numbers for the whole US so far this year compared to the black line, which was last year. We've been at record levels in this data series all year this year in terms of the amount of poor to very poor pasture conditions. The dotted lines of various colors depict different regions of the country. And so at the top of the graph, you have a purple dotted line that shows the southern plains, that's Texas and Oklahoma, have really advanced in terms of the percent poor and very poor in the last 2 to 3 weeks. But all regions really are increasing right now in the last couple of weeks. The Great Plains, which is Kansas north through the Dakotas. The western region is the green line, starting to tip back up a little bit. And even the Corn Belt now showing up with a significant increase in drought conditions. Next. Unfortunately, you know, there doesn't appear to be a lot of reason for optimism in this respect. This is the latest drought outlook map released just a few days ago by the Climate Prediction Center for the next 3 months. And it suggests that we continue to see drought in the regions that have drought now, possibly more drought development in some regions in the Midwest and a little bit down in the Gulf states. And, you know, as you read the climatologist, I'm not a climatologist, but, you know, the implications are that we have been in a strong La Nina, and that we're really going to continue to be in La Nina for the remainder of the year and at least into the beginning of next year. So it doesn't look overall very favorable. Obviously, there'll be some, you know, specific regional opportunities for some moisture within that. Next slide. You know, one of the cumulative effects of the drought carrying over from last year is the situation for hay. We already saw pasture conditions. This was the map for hay stocks on May 1, which is the beginning of the hay crop year. So really, what did we carry, you know, from last year and what was left at the end of the winter? And you can see, not surprisingly, those northern plain states, which are big hay producing states, were severely down in hay stocks as of May 1st, as were a number of other states around the country. So, you know, we have a lot of poor forage conditions in terms of pasture. We have limited hay stocks and limited hay production going on this year. So really a lot of challenges across the board. Next. As a result, not surprisingly, you know, we're seeing and expect to continue to see record high hay prices going forward. So this shows data series for alfalfa hay and all other hay. And both of those are at record levels, forecast to be even more strongly at record levels this year. Next slide. Aside from that, obviously feed grain prices and supplemental feed prices are high as well. So, you know, feedlot impacts, you can see this graph shows Kansas feedlot data for cost of gain for steers. The dotted line shows you where we started last year in the, you know, low 80s by the end of the year with a cost of gain around $1.10, and it's moved up closer to $1.20 or even higher in some cases for these feedlot closeouts. So the feedlots are facing a lot of challenges, but so is everyone else in terms of supplemental feeds, the kinds of things that we would, you know, potentially have available to stretch limited forage supplies and so on. Again, just, you know, really no relief in sight in any direction. Next slide. The July 1 cow inventory, specifically in the mid-year report last Friday, did show a significant decrease in the beef cow herd, down about 2.4% after adjusting last year's number down from what was originally reported. And so you can see that we've dropped off. This July cow inventory actually peaked in 2018 most recently. And from that 2018 peak, we are down about 6.3% on beef cows at this point in time. And so, you know, it looks to me like very much that we will likely lose another, on an annual basis, on a calendar year basis, we'll probably lose another 1 million beef cows this year, or potentially even a little bit more than that. Next slide. Feeder cattle supplies, you know, again, those July numbers say that the calf crop actually peaked in 2018. Supplies are getting tighter. We saw that with this latest July report on the right-hand side, feeder supply. This is a calculated number based on, you know, feeder cattle that are not in feedlots and are not, you know, not heifers that are being held for replacements. This number was down 2.7% on a year-over-year basis. So we are beginning to see those feeder supplies tighten up. We have not seen all of the impacts of that yet because of the drought in part, and we'll look at that here in just a second for a minute. Next slide. Cattle on feed numbers. Again, we got a monthly cattle on feed report this last week. And, you know, we've been at record levels all year. Up to this point, feedlots have been able to maintain record feedlot inventories in part because of the impacts of the drought. And we'll break that down in just a second. You can see the July 1 inventory was just slightly above year-ago levels. And I do think as we go forward, we're going to see this number start to fall. Feedlots have been kind of defying gravity by holding these feedlot inventories high, but I don't think they can continue to do that from this point forward. Next slide. One of the ways they've been able to do that, in particular the last couple of months, in June, the placements overall were down 2.4%. But you can see from this weight breakdown that all of that decrease was in the right-hand side in the heavyweight categories. The light placements of cattle under 700 pounds were actually up about 4% in this monthly number. So we're placing more lightweight cattle. We did exactly the same thing in May. So again, we're holding those feedlot inventories in part by borrowing against future feeder cattle supplies. And the drought is making that happen in part because we're having to move those cattle out of the country as forage supplies are depleted. And so, we're seeing some early weaning, some early movement of cattle, of these feeder cattle into the feedlots. Next slide. If you look at the July 1 breakdown of steers and heifers on feed, first the steers, it is coming down over time, and we expect that. Feeder supplies are getting tighter. Again, we peaked these overall, calf crop numbers in 2018, and you can see the steers are down. But next slide, the heifers actually tipped up in this latest report last week. And again, that's really a drought impact, I think. We've had elevated heifer slaughter all year, and this number says that we've got more heifers on feed than last year. We're still having to move and divert these heifers into the feedlots, and we're going to continue to see these heifers work through the feedlot and on into heifer slaughter as we go forward. Next slide. So the other half of that, of course, is that we're not saving heifers. We're not retaining heifers as beef cow replacements. This number was down 3.5% on the July 1 basis. And, going forward, we're going to have a very limited supply of heifer calves and bred heifers as we go into next year. I think the impacts of that are going to really limit what we can do. At some point in time, we assume the drought will break and we'll get some relief, and we'll think about what to do after that. But we're going to be starting with a very limited supply of heifers in order to make that happen. Next slide. Cattle slaughter so far this year is actually up. On the bottom, the total is up through the first half of the year, or just the first week or two of July, up 1.5% for the year to date. Steers are down, but heifers are up 3.9%. Again, beef cows are up 14%. Dairy cows are actually down slightly, but total cow slaughter is up nearly 6% so far this year. So elevated beef cow slaughter, elevated heifer slaughter, we're slaughtering females. And again, that has implications for not only this year, but for the next several years. Next slide. This really came home to roost, particularly in the Southern Plains in the last couple of weeks. These are reported cull cow prices for boning cows in the month of July across 5 different markets. And if you look at the July 2nd numbers, the prices were still very good. They've been remarkably good most of the year up to this point. And they were good across these 5 markets and pretty similar. If you look at the latest week, July 23rd, you can see particularly in the Oklahoma City and Dodge City markets, these cull cow markets are really being overwhelmed with a number of cattle moving to market right now. We've seen a dramatic crash. We're hearing lots and lots of stories about how backed up auctions are. The regional cow killing plants are backed up. So, again, the drought effects are really picking up. They're actually accelerating, at least regionally here in the Southern Plains in the last couple of weeks. Next slide. This is a little bit busy, but if you look at the dynamics of the herd on the top, this is actually January 1 numbers. So you see the same thing we saw with the July numbers. Beef cow herd bottomed in 2014. It peaked in 2019 on a January 1 basis, and we've been coming down since then. But the way you get there in that bottom graph, if you look at the blue line, that's heifer retention, stated as a percent of the cow herd. And the red line is cow culling, which is beef cow slaughter as a percent of the beef cow herd. And when you look at the expansion that happened, that yellow shaded box on the right-hand side, from 2014 to 2019, the way you grow that herd is by both of those aspects. You save a lot more heifers. We had record heifer retention in 2014 going into 2015. We had record low cow culling in 2015 because of obviously the incentives we had. So what I'm suggesting here is that while we're now pulling numbers down, I think this drought is taking us to levels lower than we intended to be, need to be. The market would tell us that we should be, and I think that's going to have implications going forward. Next slide. The bottom line is the blue line shows cow slaughter in total cattle slaughter, in 2015 was the lowest since 1963. And that spike low in cattle slaughter happens at the time when we're saving the most amount of heifers for retention, for breeding, when we're cutting cow culling to the minimum. And of course, you see the price line there. The red line shows the market's response to that during that time period. So far on the right-hand side, cattle slaughter hasn't dropped off yet, and it hasn't even dropped off in the first half of the year, but it is going to drop off as we go forward. Next slide. I think sometime in the next few years, we're setting up a scenario probably pretty similar to what happened in that 2013 to 2016 kind of time frame. Now, we don't know the timing of that yet because we don't even know the bottom of this thing yet. We haven't moved past that, but once we move past the drought, at some point in time, we're going to have tremendous incentives to rebuild this industry because I think we're going lower than we ever intended to be. I think that's my last slide as far as information to share. Greg?
All right, thank you, Darrell. Certainly a devastating outlook for the country as a whole, and it just seems like this drought is different, maybe more widespread than the last one a decade ago. Let's hear from some of the people who actually have boots on the ground out in the country. Let's start with Joe Leathers. Joe, would you give us your insight from Guthrie, Texas?
Well, thank you, Greg. Yeah, I've just like a lot of folks that's watching this. I lived through the droughts in 2010, 11, and 12 along in there, and you know, we thought we had a good drought management plan, emergency management plan back then with you know, reasonable stocking rate and irrigated ground with improved grass on it. And I learned that you can hardly put enough water on improved grass in order to keep it growing to stay ahead of the cows in conditions like we had then. I see this scenario shaping up to be the exact same way. We did purchase some more land and put in a backgrounding yard. And since then, I have never fully stocked our ranch with mother cows. I've always kept a portion of it for yearlings, and we've liquidated the yearlings at this point. We went into last winter in really good shape, pretty good tank water, good growth on grass, but we got zero rain through the winter. Cows were starting to suffer a little bit as they calved and started nursing calves. And coming into spring, I needed to be moving cows at that point, but because they were calving, I couldn't. Our tank water, our tanks that we capture rainwater had dried up, and so we were down to pipelines and windmills. And so with the options I had, we've got 4 ranches in Texas and now have 1 in Oregon. But we moved over 1,000 cows as soon, paired them up and moved them as soon as the calves were big enough to pair up and move. And now I'm at the point, we did catch some late spring rains and grew a little grass, caught some water at our Guthrie ranch. And so we're still setting at Guthrie a third of our cows off the ranch, or off, you know, the Guthrie ranch. And so right now today, we are not going to bring those cows back. I'm thinking a year ahead of time. Number one, we're probably going to have to wean our calves early, get them on feed. And actually, that's where I'm headed today, is to look at some opportunities for that. And then in order to protect our country and have enough forage for the cows and enough forage not to hurt the land, we're probably going to remain very lightly stocked. When we preg this fall, we'll cull cows, and then we'll decide how many replacement heifers we want to keep, if any, but it'll be a reduced number, I'm sure.
Joe, did you feel like you had recovered from the previous drought when this hit?
Yes, we didn't bring any cattle back. We completely did in 11. We completely depopulated our Guthrie ranch and moved half the cows off of our Dixon Creek division. We moved well over 4,000 cows back then. And then we didn't bring them back even after it rained for 2 more years and let that land recover. So our ranch has recovered up until this point, and then we're trying now not to get back in that same situation. The problem we have is, we had 6 half-mile pivots in 11. We still have those, but it takes too long to get around and water that grass with the heat over 100 degrees and wind blowing. And so the country that we purchased and we developed into a backgrounding situation has 18 250-acre traps that has improved grass on it with smaller pivots. That's where we moved the majority of those cows to, and liquidated yearlings and didn't take in any yearlings or buy any, and are running our pairs that we moved there. But even at the smaller pivots, it was having a hard time getting the growth that it normally would. And then we had grasshoppers come in, and that's one aspect that here in Texas, and I don't know about other states, but if the grasshoppers come in, it's devastating in a drought situation. And then desert termites can come in. So we have a lot of forage, dry forage right now, but if the desert termites hit, they're going to slick off vast areas, and we'll have to make more adjustments at that time.
Tony, let's go to you in California for your perspective.
Well, thanks, Greg. California is pretty diverse, from irrigated valleys to the native foothill country up into the forest permits, that type of thing. Where we run our cattle, it's basically all native pastures. So our grass season starts, we start getting rain when we get it, first part of November, and we're usually done and starting to turn to dry in May. We got a little bit of a false positive in December. We had probably one of the best Decembers I can remember. Not very extreme to the cold side, got some good rains. Things were looking pretty good. January 1, it's like it just shut off completely. Right now, we've got some old feed. Cows looking pretty decent shape. The concern right now is the stock water. And even in the farming areas, down in the valleys where there's irrigated pasture or permanent crops, that types of thing, water is just a precious commodity. And there's been curtailments. Lack of storage in the past has hurt us. It's just a pretty dire situation out here right now as far as water for irrigation. Again, like I mentioned, we don't irrigate any of our feed. We completely rely on rainfall where we're at. We just added a couple of ranches this year, so we're right around 11,000 acres, and we're going to use all, and that's between owned, leased, and permitted ground that we run on. But it's looking at Daryl's forecast, that takes a little bit of wind out of your sails. With the numbers he was showing there, a little bit of the wind out of your sails, thinking and hoping for what could happen in fall. And that's kind of what we're down to out in California and in the West primarily. I mean, it's just, it's not a very good situation. Hay, I just bought some orchard grass hay and it costs $400 a ton. Not alfalfa, orchard grass. I got some, I see Steve shaking his head. I was checking around for some alfalfa hay the other day. I got bid $4 to $425. We've got a pretty good fire going in our neighborhood right now, about 10, 11 miles from our ranch. And that was speaking with my ag commissioner the other day, I went on a little mission to try and help get some hay donated, get it up to our fairgrounds to where we can provide a little relief to the people that are getting impacted by that fire. While everybody was generous and we had some great donations and that kind of thing, you're starting to look at a retriever load of hay is like 72 bales of alfalfa hay. You're talking about $1,800, $3,300 for a couple of them. You're pushing a lot of money for the feed. So, it's supplement, it's the water, it's the feed. And quite frankly, it's not a very good situation looking at a potential continuance of the La Nina going into the fall. That's pretty much where we're at.
Right. You froze up there, Tony, but I'm going to go ahead and move to Steve,
Oh,
who
sure.
Steve's from Western Nebraska. Go ahead, Steve. Tell us what you see.
Well, you know, we're very much similar to these other guys. We've got maybe just a little bit more of a break from some of the bad stuff. We had a pretty good rain last September. You know, when you talk, you had a pretty good rain last September. It's kind of tough, but we've had a pretty good rain last September. Our cow herd, basically, we have kept all the heifers we're going to breed and kept them in the feedlot. Basically, we have a small feedlot where we just feed our own cattle. So we kept all the heifers we're going to breed, or we are breeding. In fact, hopefully they have bred, but we kept all them in the feedlot, and they're there today. And we brought all of our first calf heifers down to the farm. And I might say this, our ranch is 85 miles from our farm. So we have two different operating places. And we brought all the first calf pairs down. And the guys at the ranch felt that if basically that takes a third of our stocking, that if we could keep the other 2/3 on the ranch, they could run them through the summer if they got a little bit of help. And we have had a little bit of help. Northern Nebraska has had just a little bit of rain, and we're on the southern edge of that. It's very, very dry. And we're within probably 10 days of either thinking about weaning in 3 to 4 weeks, or if we could get a little bit of a rain, wean sometime in that first week in September. And usually doing 2 drafts and kind of give some time on some wet meadows. We've cut hay up at the ranch, and we're probably 30% of our normal growth on hay, what they've cut at the ranch so far. Down at the farm, we subsidize the ranch with hay because we don't run them up there in the winter. They come down and run on our corn stalks in the winter. So that does help us a little. We've got a chance to get through the winter with reasonable. But anyway, we've got about, probably a third of what we would normally raise on our farm on dry land situations. That's about what we're going to get for hay. So we're struggling with hay. We haven't got the prices you guys got because we have the luxury, and it's an interesting word, but we can go out into our pivots, our irrigated pivots, and take a rake corn stalks, and then bale that and bring that in and mix that with distillers. And we can feed our cow herd and everything we need to with that distillers. And obviously our calves would remain in the feedlots, but we can get by. It's just that if we don't get any relief this summer, because basically last fall started that really dry condition. We had pretty good rain until about June of last year. And then once the 1st of July hit, it shut off up there and shut off down on our farm. Or last year we had subsoil moisture going into this. It made a huge difference in how much could grow and did grow. Now this year, we just had no subsoil to start. We have dry land corn, and that's where we get a lot of our feed value. And basically, we have lost half of our dry land corn at this stage. We won't cut a bushel of corn. It's falling over, so there will be no hay type of thing there either. And if we don't get rain of some sort in the next 10 days, we will lose the rest of our dry land corn. Our irrigated crops are hanging on pretty well. So we will have feed for our cows this winter. It's going to be, it's a typical thing. We're going to have to subsidize it with a little bit of distillers and some of those ground corn stalks, because we're going to have to make it last longer, because we can't go back up there as quick next year, because we just won't recover until we get some change in the weather.
So I'm going to ask all three of you this same question, and this is more of an industry-wide looking question, but we all know that by age, ranchers typically are a little older farmers than the rest of agriculture. Is this going to drive more people out of ranching? Is it going to have an impact? And if it does, what do you think that will do to land prices? So, Steve, I'll go back to you.
I think that's an interesting point. I basically, we had a little bit of a birthday party up at the ranch the other night with in the town near the ranch, and there's 3 or 4 guys sitting in there. The very same thing you said. They said, I don't know if I'm going to restock or not. In fact, if I have to sell, I'm just not going to restock. And most of these guys are not you know, they don't have family coming back or something like that. It's people that probably would have gotten out in 5 to 10 years anyway. But most of these guys are going to, I don't see them restocking or redoing it. And as far as the value on the land, it's kind of been Nebraska and everywhere else. We're not going to see these land prices depress. I just don't see that happening. There's a lot of people that want to expand, want to do things. You know, there's young families coming back, and there's dads that have, you know, saved some money and have some equity, and they're going to help those kids expand if they can.
Tony?
I would concur with Steve, and you know, I'm in the land valuation business as well, and I haven't seen much of a downtick in land prices. If anything else, it's kind of gotten stronger, and I think a lot of it's been driven by COVID. People want out, you know, in highly populated California, people want out of the cities. They want to get out and they want to live a real life, and that's been I think a driving force. So you're seeing more and more influx coming from the urban areas, getting out into rural areas, buying those 40-acre ranchettes, and it's carrying up into larger acreages, a couple hundred, you know, into thousands of acres if people can afford that. So, you know, and as far as the young people getting into it, you know, with the age and the rising age of the average rancher or farmer in the United States, that may create more opportunities. Yes, it's a capital intensive business. It's tough to get a start, but you know, those may also turn into silver linings for young people wanting to get started. Someone to be able to say, hey, you know, why don't you come in and give it a try? I'll rent you the ranch and see what you can do there. So there may be opportunities that way as well. But as far as land prices, especially in California, I mean, when you can sell $60,000 an acre set of pistachios in Kern County, or you could come up to the Central Valley and pay $40,000 or $50,000 for almonds per acre, it gets pretty competitive. So, you know, I would completely agree with Steve. I don't see it going too far south, if anything.
Joe, I'm assuming you don't see any $50,000 an acre land where you're at, but you may have some Californians moving in there.
Well, there already are Californians moving into Texas. You know, I agree with everything that's been said. Number one, I don't see land prices going down. But I see that a little bit different than these guys do. There's a lot of the land that's being bought up. Yes, it is people that's wanting to get. COVID did have some effect on that, but a lot of the bigger places that's being bought are investors. It'll be an investor group that's looking to put their money in. As we see our economy go through the turmoil that it's going through, there's going to be a lot of people looking for a place to house their money that's safe. And I think land is going to be that place to put it. As far as young people, an old rancher I heard one time said a drought culls not only gives you an opportunity to cull your cows, but it culls out the wannabes. And there's some folks that got into ranching because more of it as a hobby or something that they wanted to do, and I think you'll see those go out. One thing I have learned over the years going through some of these droughts and bad markets and what have you, there's an opportunity for the young people to see what dad and granddad did and learn from that. But to add to that, the ranching industry at its best, the farming industry at its best, there's not enough return on investment to be really, you know, to make a young person really want to get into it unless they have the ability to think outside the box. And I think our industry is going to have to start thinking outside the box, and ranching 101 like dad and granddad did it is not going to pay the bills. And so I think it gives us an opportunity to become, this has almost become a bad word in our industry or in our country, but gives you an opportunity to be progressive and come up with some new ideas to make ends meet.
You know, Greg,
Bill, I'm going to move to you and tell you that after listening to you and the other panelists here, this drought seems different than the one a decade ago. It seems like it's hitting harder. Obviously, it comes on the heels of COVID. We've seen these prices, as you mentioned, stay pretty good, which is an indication that beef demand is still strong. But we seem to be pulling this cow herd down quite a ways.
I think so. And yeah, again, part of it, I mentioned, I think it's the cumulative effect. Somebody mentioned earlier that the drought a decade ago was extremely severe in the Texas-Oklahoma region, but it was a relatively confined regional drought. Just happened to be right where there's a tremendous number of cows. And so it had a huge impact. This has been much more widespread, and it does go back at least 2 years. And I think those effects, are cumulative to some extent. You exhaust things more and more each time, each year that this thing hangs on. The other thing I didn't mention earlier, and I feel like I'm the source of all the bad news here, but the other point I was going to make earlier that is a little different, I think, from say 2011, from my perspective, is that this spring, areas east of here that generally were not in drought situation at that time, I heard over and over again from my colleagues and from producers everywhere that had moisture was because of the high prices of inputs, fertilizer and fuel. They were not using those inputs. That's what the market was telling them to do. So not only is the drought reducing forage production and hay production in the drought areas, but we're seeing less production in other regions. And I talked to producers as early as March that were saying in areas east of here where they weren't in drought, but they're saying, I'm going to not keep as many heifers as usual because I know I'm not going to make as much hay because I didn't fertilize as much. So, the one thing that to me that's a little different this year in Oklahoma, at least compared to 2011, a decade ago, you could sit out on I-35 and in a half an hour and count, 10 or 20 or 25 semi loads of hay moving south into that very relatively confined drought region. You won't see that this year because there's just no place really anywhere in the country that's got any excess hay supplies. And so I think that's going to limit what we can do in terms of sourcing hay. It's going to limit what we can do in terms of relocating some cows compared to that drought. And that combined with the cumulative effects, I think you're absolutely right, Greg. This thing, and that's what's really become apparent to me in the last 2 or 3 weeks in particular, is this thing is probably really taking a toll on us that's growing rapidly at this point in time.
So obviously, you mentioned the fuel prices are higher, and quite a bit higher than they were a decade ago. Inflation's up. From a feed yard standpoint, we're not going to just automatically start moving more cattle because the feed yard, they're saddled with higher costs as well. That may affect how you project feeder cattle prices this fall.
We've been projecting all year a trend higher in feeder cattle prices. We knew we were moving at least, into tighter supplies generally, just because we have been in liquidation for the last 3 to 4 years, depending on the time of year you measure it. So that was coming anyway, and that certainly will continue at this point. Feedlots are again have been successful up to this point at keeping their numbers up, and that's it's a volume business. They try to keep that feed mill churning, but they're going to face, I think, a particular squeeze going forward because there just aren't going to be the cattle to continue to do that. At the same time, because of the cost of gain, the costs are very high, and so it's going to be a real dilemma for them as well as we move into these tighter supplies. We think it's really going to hit. It always takes longer than I think. So I've been wrong for 4 or 5 months on turning the corner here, but I'm going to be right sooner or later. I'm just convinced that we're just about out of the ability to stretch these feeder supplies. And we're going to see this thing tighten up significantly here before the end of the year.
I'm going to come back to you for another question, Daryl, in a moment. I want to remind our audience, if you have questions for our panel, put it in the Q&A. And I'm going to go back to our ranch panelists and ask them all one at a time how this drought may impact your ranch's ability to maintain the high quality of cattle that our industry has moved to in the last 10 years. And I'll start with you, Tony.
I think for us, to maintain the high quality, it's going to make culling a lot easier. I mean, when you don't have the feed or you don't have the water, or you've got tight supplies on everything, you're going to sharpen the pencil in the culling standard. So that's what we'll shoot for. I mean, we're going to try our very best. You know, we want to maintain producing a good product, a quality product. And if it's we're in survival mode. So make the best we can, make the best decisions we can, and try to write it out the best we can. So I think it's a lot of it will be in the culling and the selection of heifers that we will retain.
Do you feel like your female is about the same size that it was a decade ago?
Yeah, I don't believe we've changed that much. We try to select for a moderate to moderate larger type of female, you know, that shows some growth, shows some stretch, that can make a calf that's going to weigh, 1,500 pounds when he's done. And
right.
To put those quality genetics behind it, we spend a lot of time trying to evaluate the bulls we use and something that fits our environment where these cows have to work at. It's not easy. So they're in the brush, they're in the hills, they're in the rocks, and they have to do a lot of hard work to make it happen. So we're pretty staunch on how we look at the cow.
Joe, you see any changes to your selection or the product that you're going to be able to produce?
Well, obviously I see a change in the number of cows that we're going to have by the time we come out of this drought. But not that I've had any silver bullet or a crystal ball, but last fall I sorted our cows up into, on our ranches. I have 2 ranches that I put what I call our number ones, and then everything at Guthrie were number 2s. And that was based on phenotype and how those cows looked sucking a calf when we weaned in the fall. So I kept the best of the best. I'll cull out of that second, what I would call our number 2 cows is where I'll start the culling this fall. And hopefully, if it's done right, when we come out of this drought, the base herd that we have left will be the top end or the better quality cows. So I'm going to take a negative and try to make a positive out of it over a period of time. And I think most everybody in the industry is going to do the same thing. I'm going to pick the cows that breed in the first cycle, that raise the best calves, that give the right amount of milk, not too much milk so that they can't maintain their body weight and their body score. And so that's how we will approach it at the ranch.
Steve?
I agree completely with what they've said. Both guys have hit it right on the head. We're not going to change much. We hope not to change much, but it's going to be that good set of cows, the number 1 cows that always calve early. Those are the ones that are going to get saved. We'll cull harder, but what we'll probably end up doing is to get our body condition back where it was, is we'll end up putting a little extra feed in those cows in the wintertime on the corn stalk so that we can get them into good shape to head back to the ranch to calve in the spring. And then we're just going to have to hope that we'll have enough rain to make that work. But at this stage, I don't see us culling too many numbers, just so we can hope to hang on and maybe make this rain thing happen next spring and work. We'll still have to bring some stuff home to the feedlot. We know that, if we can stock our ranch at 2/3 again next year, like we're doing this year, and we have some rain, it should allow us to recover normally. And then hopefully the next year things would return somewhat to normal. But no, we'll still try to produce the best quality beef we can. And probably it'll be produced a little quicker because we're going to have to wean a little quicker than usual. So one of the things we'll do is we'll put those calves in the feedlot, and they will just go out quicker than they have before. And that, traditionally that price is a little better in late April, early May than it is in mid-June traditionally when we sell our calves. So we hope to gain some of that back by that type of strategy.
Do the 3 of you see your financial institutions, your bankers, working with you more now? I know the Fed just raised rates again today, and this is something we didn't see a decade ago necessarily. But what are your financial advisors telling you? Tony?
We haven't had too much of a problem with our lender at this point. I mean, the
So,
big-
so I'm not asking you specifically, but just what are you hearing among your California
financial
cattlemen and you know, and do you hear of problems now?
Well, water, obviously. I mean, the Sigma legislation in California. I know not everybody across the country is familiar with that, but it's basically regulatory environment for groundwater usage. That's huge for us. I mean, it's the old adage of whiskey's for drinking and water's for fighting, and that's the way it is out here. So that's a huge deal on the radar. You know, and your business practices, how you're managing your operation, what you're doing. You know, we're being watched for that, and also this sustainability thing is creeping in. Nobody likes that word, but I'm hearing that, and I'm hearing the drum beats of that, and I know lenders are getting pushed. I've heard this getting pushed. You know, what are your guys out there doing? Questionnaires maybe now coming out. What kind of practices are you employing to be sustainable and those types of things? So there's changes coming, but the thing that's going to drive it in California is going to be the water thing, and that's Sigma legislation. We haven't quite got to the point yet where we can quantify just how it's affecting or impacting values one way or the other, but it's going to be there, and it's coming.
Steve, I'll move to you.
You know, much like Tony, we don't see much pressure from the bankers as far as what they're thinking. You know, we're going to have to sharpen our pencils because for sure the interest rates are going to go up. You know, we are money right on summer through the going to change. Those numbers are going to change. So it can cost one of the two, but we're going to have to do something to keep the situation as it is today. You know, our grain, you know, the grain farm contributes to it all. You know, we have a very diverse operation, and right now the grain thing's in pretty good shape, and it's probably subsidizing the cattle thing just a little bit. But we all know that the sure cure for high prices is high prices, and we're going to drive those grain prices down, and so that's going to affect the profitability of our whole ranch. So we're going to have to watch things and pay attention, because one of the big problems is the interest rates, and that's going to affect us.
Joe, you live in a big state, and I know that there's a lot of smaller ranches in the eastern part of the state, some of the bigger ones out where you are, probably a diverse set of financial situations, but what are you hearing?
Well, one thing I do know is when you go into a drought, the decisions that you make, whether you think you're making the right decision for you, may not be the right decision for the neighbor because of the financial situation. I have not heard of any bankers that are pulling out or getting harder to get along with. I think it was pretty well stated when they said everybody's going to have to sharpen their pencils. But there's no money. You're not going to make money in a drought. You go into survival mode. And it's how well you hang on and what kind of relationship you've had with your banker. And I think if you go into it with a good management plan and you can show a banker how you're going to get through this, I think the banker will go with you.
Right. Daryl, I promised I would come back to you because I'm going to put you on the spot here. And the one area we have not talked about, and I see a lot on social media about imports and exports, especially during this drought, that our imports are up because of the drought. So tell us the straight scoop here. What is the drought going to affect imports, and how will that impact our ranchers' prices?
Well, again, if you look at kind of getting to this point, you know, we've had very strong exports first that have contributed. You mentioned earlier, and I concur that the demand has been and continues to be pretty strong, in some ways remarkably strong, given everything we've been through from the pandemic up to this point. On the import side, our imports have been up the last year or two. As we tighten up beef production, we will see, and we're probably going to see those price impacts here at some point. If you go back to 2014, we had record high prices. That does attract meat from around the world. So we'll see some market reaction to that in the global markets, as well as in the domestic markets. So at this point in time, there's a little bit of adjustment going on. Some of these international markets are quite fluid. Of course, we've seen a lot of changes in the global market in terms of who the major drivers are. In total, China/Hong Kong have been the major drivers, and that's had a lot of secondary effects then on flows of meat around the world. So, they're part of the picture. I don't think they're a major factor one way or the other in terms of this going forward, but they will certainly be a part of things, and there will be some responses as we see our markets adjust. Greg, I mentioned earlier, and I sort of showed with a little bit of trepidation, this idea that we might do something, a little bit like 14 and 15 in response to the drought that we're in now, which was a little like 2011, 12, and 13. Makes me a little nervous to say that, but it really looks more and more like it to me at this point. There's a couple things about that. One is we do not know the timing yet. So, we're just going to have to wait and see. We don't know at what point we kind of, put the peg in place and say, okay, we're moving past the drought in some significant way. That's one of the issues. The other part of it is this last conversation that everybody had about input costs and financial structure has a lot to do with it too, because when we talk about herd rebuilding, that's really predicated on profitability expectations. It's not just price. And so it's going to depend on where we are with the inflationary environment we're in, what shape the macroeconomy is in, and what the profit prospects look like for the industry. That's going to be the real determinant on when we sort of get really serious about trying to expand. And so we have to watch all of that, as well as the drought conditions specifically in terms of what we can do. Then there's the question of what do we want to do and when do we want to do it?
Let me step back and ask you to expand a little bit. So you mentioned the high beef cow slaughter for the year. And if assuming it begins to rain, we stop that, will we not import more hamburger meat to make up for some of those cows we won't be killing in the next few years?
At some point in time, that market will get significantly tighter. And so, definitely we will, because I think this thing will turn. We're probably going to have, there's almost no doubt that we will have record levels of cow culling this year, but that'll probably flip-flop at some point, not necessarily next year, but it potentially as early as next year will flip-flop. And we may go back and do like we did in 2015 and have record low cow culling. And part of that will be possible because we have culled so hard. We're going to have those young productive cows these guys are trying to hang on to, and we'll have the ability to defer some culling for a year or two when we want to. And in that process, then there will be a lot of tightness in that lean beef market, and that and the prices will certainly impact the flows of meat from the standpoint of some imports.
Do you know, Daryl, how beef demand compared to the decade ago drought we had? I mean, I know that coming out of COVID, we've all been surprised at how robust beef demand has been. Do you remember where we were at a decade ago?
We've got some indices. I don't know them off the top of my head, but I think we're every bit as strong or maybe a little bit stronger. There was a pretty strong demand response coming out of the 2008, 9, 10 recession last time. There was some pent-up demand, and it's a little bit like what we saw last year, which I think was some pent-up demand really coming out of the pandemic and folks getting back to doing things and sort of making up for not doing things for about a year. And that's been part of our driver. So I think beef demand is probably in a similar to perhaps a little bit stronger situation at this point in time.
I do have a question from the audience here, and it's directed to our panelists. What are the thoughts on keeping cattle in programs? So in other words, like the NHTC, GAP programs, Angus Source, for example. Do you believe it's an important factor for you all, or is this something that you would pull out of? So, Joe, would you like to start?
Yeah, we're gonna have to keep this going because where I'm sitting, it's actually raining a little bit. So the longer we talk, maybe the more rain we'll get here. But look, for me as a producer, being in an all-natural program or an NHTC program totally has to do with my customer base. So if my avenue to sell cattle is to a customer base that wants an all-natural, I'm going to give them an all-natural. If they want an NHTC, I'm going to give them an NHTC. And the economy and inflation is going to determine some of that. There's a lot of people that want all-natural meat whenever they've got extra money in their pocketbook. When they don't have that extra income, they're probably not going to really care if it's all-natural or not. So we just have to make each individual, each operation is going to have to make the determination. Can they still get a premium for those calves if they're an all-natural? That's the way I look at it.
Steve, Tony, would you like to comment?
You know, I would agree with Joe. I think we're going to see a little of consumer reaction to some of these specialized programs, and you know, $5 gas and double-digit inflation, that sort of thing. You know, you go to town and you fill up your car and you go down to buy groceries, and pretty soon some of that exotic stuff that you used to buy isn't going to be as attractive as it once was. And I really believe we're going to head the other way from some of those branded programs. It may not be a long ways away. We're still going to have people that want quality, but I don't think it's going to affect necessarily the way I feed anything anymore. But I think we're going to see some reaction at the grocery store, and you'll see then that go back to the feeder, and they'll, you know, they'll pay for some of those things, but they're not going to pay like they did before. And so I think you're going to see kind of maybe not away from the branded programs, but you're going to see some things go away from the GAP and the NHTC, those sort of things that take longer on feed and end up costing quite a bit more.
Yeah, we've participated in third-party verification programs the last few years, and it's done well for us. But I think Joe pretty well hit the nail on the head. The customers, the driver, that they vote with the dollar bill, and we will react and respond to how that goes. You know, if it changes, like they say, you got to have the story about moving the cheese. You got to be ready for it and anticipate it, and we'll be watching for that as well.
Gentlemen, our hour is just about up. I want to thank you all for joining us. We had just a wonderful conversation today, and I pray that rain falls for all of you and we get out of this as soon as possible. And thank you to our audience for joining us. This has been Drover's Drought webinar. I'm going to ask if Susan, if you have a closing slide. I don't see one. There we go. So if you want to respond to us, you can by going to agweb.com and sending us an email or a chat. Otherwise, thank you very much. Thank you all for attending.